The shove came without warning. One moment, Commander Elena Voss was standing at the edge of the training field, boots planted, clipboard pressed flat against her chest. The next, Senior Chief Ryan Maddox had crossed 4 feet of open ground and driven the heel of his palm into her shoulder, hard enough to send dust spraying from beneath her feet. She didn't fall. She didn't step back. She just looked at him. 2,800 Marines stood in absolute silence. Nobody breathed. Nobody moved. Because in 22 years of service, not one person had ever seen Ryan Maddox challenged. And she was still standing there. If you're new here, subscribe before this story is over. Drop your city in the comments below so I can see exactly how far this has traveled. Hit that like button and stay close, because what happens next is the kind of thing they don't write in any official file. The morning began the way most mornings did at Thornfield Marine Training Installation, with heat, noise, and men competing to be the loudest thing in the room. Camp Thornfield sat 30 miles inland from the California coast on a flat stretch of hard-packed desert that the Marine Corps had been using to build warriors for 4 decades. The installation was functional and unforgiving in the way that military infrastructure always was. Concrete buildings the color of old bone, chain-link fencing stretched across the perimeter like stitches, and a training ground so brutalized by boots and vehicle tracks that nothing green had attempted to grow there in years. In the early morning, when the sun was still low and the air still carried a thin bite of cold, the place almost looked dignified. By 07:30, dignity was gone. The briefing hall at the eastern edge of the compound held roughly 60 personnel when it was formally arranged. 2 rows of folding chairs, a projection screen bolted to the front wall, and a podium that everyone used but nobody liked because the microphone feedback had never once been fixed in 11 years of reported maintenance requests. On that particular Tuesday in late October, the hall was holding closer to 85. Word had spread overnight. That happened on military installations. Information traveled faster than orders, faster than emails, faster than any official communication channel ever designed. All it required was one person saying something in the wrong hallway, and within 6 hours, every non-commissioned officer, every junior officer, and every specialist who had nothing better to do would find a reason to be standing near the relevant building. The word that traveled this time was simple. They're bringing in an outside advisor, a commander. She's going to be evaluating the Thornfield JTAC readiness program for the next 6 weeks. That was the official version. The unofficial version, the one that moved faster and hit harder, was this. Some woman from Naval Special Warfare Command is coming to tell the Marine Corps how to run its own house, and Maddox is already furious about it. Ryan Maddox being furious about something was not extraordinary news. Ryan Maddox had spent the better part of 2 decades being furious about something. It was practically a personality trait at this point, cataloged alongside his physical endurance and his tactical precision as one of the defining features of a man who had built himself into something that the United States military used as a recruiting poster and a cautionary tale simultaneously. I was 44 years old, built like a defensive lineman who had decided to also become a marathon runner, and he carried himself with the particular confidence of someone who had been in enough real combat situations to stop pretending the rules of normal social interaction applied to him. His record was legitimate. 24 classified operations across 4 different theaters, multiple commendations, a reputation in the special operations community that preceded him into every room by approximately 30 seconds. He was also, as a number of people quietly understood but rarely said aloud, exceptionally difficult to work with when he felt his authority was being questioned. And an outside evaluation of a program he considered personally, his felt very much like a question. He was standing at the front of the briefing hall when Elena Voss arrived, in the middle of a sentence directed at Gunnery Sergeant Dale Portman about the inadequacy of the current radio protocol assessment criteria. He didn't break stride when the side door opened, didn't look up from the tactical diagram spread across the table in front of him. Elena came in without ceremony. She was 41, medium height, and dressed in a utility uniform that had been worn enough to look comfortable rather than sharp. No decorative posturing, no visible medals, no subtle cues that she was performing the role of important person walking into a room. She carried a worn canvas notebook in her left hand and a cold cup of institutional coffee in her right, and she found an open position near the back wall and stood there without introducing herself to anyone. Portman noticed her first. He was good at noticing things. It was the quality that had kept him alive through 3 deployments and probably would for whatever came next. He glanced at her, clocked the rank insignia, and then very carefully looked back at Maddox without changing his expression. Maddox kept talking. The briefing covered the day's schedule, a multi-element coordination exercise that had been designed to test inter-team communication under simulated communications degradation. The scenario assumed a forward operating base had experienced partial radio failure during an active operation, and the three participating teams would need to maintain coordination using backup protocols while also managing a simulated hostile contact event in the third training block. It was a solid exercise design. Portman had worked on it for 2 weeks. Elena was taking notes on something in her notebook, though she hadn't been given any briefing materials. Maddox finally looked up. He saw her. Something moved across his face, not surprise exactly, more like recognition of a category. He had seen advisors before. They came in waves, usually following some congressional funding review or some Joint Chiefs directive about cross-service integration, and they universally shared one trait. They arrived thinking they understood something, and they left having learned that they didn't, and the process was always more disruptive than it needed to be. He finished the sentence he was on, handed the diagram back to Portman, and walked down the center of the room. He stopped about 4 feet from her. "Commander Voss? Senior Chief?" She didn't look up from whatever she was writing. "The briefing was at 0700. "I know, I was here at 0650. She turned a page in the notebook. "I sat in the back. You were in the middle of something, so I didn't interrupt." Maddox looked at Portman. Portman looked at the table. "You should have identified yourself." "I'm identifying myself now." She finally looked up. Her eyes were dark, steady, and carrying approximately no apology. "I'm here to observe the readiness evaluation cycle for the JTAC integration program. I'll need access to the radio assessment records from the last 8 weeks, the after-action reports from October's coordination exercises, and a position at the back of the training field during today's scenario." Maddox was quiet for a moment. "You're here to observe," he said. "That's correct?" "Not to participate." "I didn't say that." The room had gone carefully still. There were 11 people in the briefing hall besides the 2 of them, and not one of them was making eye contact with anyone else. This was the trained response of experienced military personnel. Witnessing a confrontation between 2 senior figures, complete sensory withdrawal, reduced profile, wait for the situation to resolve itself without your involvement. Maddox tilted his head slightly. "This is a Marine Corps training installation, Commander. The personnel here operate under established protocols. My protocols. Outside evaluation teams observe, document, and submit reports. They don't request access to records, they don't request positions on the training field, and they don't walk into briefings and start writing things down before anyone has told them what's happening." Elena closed the notebook. "I have the relevant authorization documents if you'd like to review them," she said. "But I'd suggest we skip that part, because the authorization came from a level above both of us, and spending the next 40 minutes establishing that fact is going to delay your exercise by 40 minutes, which is going to put your third training block into the hottest part of the afternoon. And the radio failure scenario is going to perform measurably worse in that heat window because your communication protocols haven't been updated for high-temperature battery degradation." She said it the way someone says something obvious that they've noticed and decided to mention without making a performance of it. Maddox stared at her. "Battery degradation. Your PRC-148 lose approximately 12% efficiency above 103 degrees. That's not my opinion, that's the manufacturer's specification. According to the weather projection for today, the training field hits that threshold between 1340 and 1610. Your third block is currently scheduled for 1400. She picked up her cold coffee. "But like I said, we can spend 40 minutes on the authorization paperwork first. It's your call." Portman made a sound that was technically a cough. Maddox looked at him. Portman found something interesting on the ceiling. The exercise launched on schedule. The training ground at Thornfield's eastern sector was a constructed approximation of an urban environment, concrete block structures that suggested buildings without actually being them, narrow alleyways between the structures, a central open area that served as the contested zone for most scenarios. The ground itself was pale and hard and threw heat back at anything standing on it with aggressive efficiency. By 0930, it was already 91 degrees. The three teams deployed from separate entry points. Alpha Team, Understaff Sergeant Gideon Okafor, came in from the north. Bravo Team, a mix of Marine Raiders and JTAC specialists, moved through the Eastern Alley corridor. The third element, a six-man communications support unit under Sergeant First Class Tommy Varga, set up at the designated relay position on the western perimeter. Maddox ran the exercise from the command observation post, a raised concrete platform at the southern edge of the training area with a direct sight line across the main zone. He had a radio in each hand and was talking to both Alpha and Bravo simultaneously, adjusting their approach timing as the simulated comms degradation began feeding false readings into the training radios. Elena stood 8 feet to his left. She wasn't watching him. She was watching the training ground. The exercise hit its first complication at the 23-minute mark. Alpha Team came around the north corner of Structure 7 and ran the approach exactly as planned, but Okafor had read the sightlines wrong, a mistake that anyone could make on a first run of a new scenario. And his team's left flank was exposed to a simulated firing position that the exercise designers had placed in the upper window of Structure 12. Under the training parameters, 2 of his people were immediately assessed as casualties. Maddox called the correction over the radio. He was clear, he was fast, and he was right about the correction itself. But Elena, still watching without speaking, wrote something in her notebook. At the 41-minute mark, Bravo Team lost radio contact with the relay unit. This was intentional, a scripted degradation event, but the backup protocol response was where the evaluation data would actually live. The protocol required Bravo Team to shift to a visual signal system, using position markers and fall back to their last confirmed grid point while re-establishing contact through Varga's relay. What actually happened was that Bravo Team's JTAC specialist, a capable but relatively junior Lance Corporal named Denton, froze for approximately 90 seconds trying to locate the backup protocol card in his kit. 90 seconds in a real scenario was a death sentence for multiple people. Maddox saw it too. His jaw tightened. Elena wrote something else. At the 58-minute mark, the exercise hit the simulated hostile contact event. Alpha and Bravo were supposed to coordinate a pincer movement through the central zone, while Varga's element maintained the communications relay. The coordination required both teams to hit their timing marks within a 60-second window. Alpha was late by 4 minutes. The pincer collapsed. The simulated hostile element broke through the eastern corridor. The exercise was officially a failure event. The training whistle sounded. Personnel began moving toward the debrief position on the southern platform. There was the particular quality of silence that exists when experienced professionals have made a mistake they already understand. No excuses, no loud analysis, just the quiet of people doing internal math on what went wrong. Maddox was standing at the edge of the platform with the radio still in his hand. He turned to Elena. "You have something to say." It wasn't a question. "Several things," she said. "You want them now or after the internal debrief?" "Now." She opened the notebook. The eastern approach timing was off by 4 minutes because your Alpha Team's route planning assumed Structure 7's north corner was a clear sight line to the relay marker. It's not. There's a 3-foot blind angle created by the wall overhang that shortens the visual window by about 30 meters. That's a planning error that happens in the room, not on the field. Whoever drew this scenario didn't walk the terrain at ground level before mapping the timing. Maddox said nothing. Your backup comms protocol card needs to be redesigned. Not because Lance Corporal Denton is a problem. He's not. He performed well under a stressful event. But because the card is formatted for someone who already knows the protocol and is just confirming steps. It's not formatted for someone executing under pressure who may be doing it for the first time in a real environment. The difference matters. She turned a page. And your radio assessment has a heat vulnerability gap. The PRC 148 efficiency issue I mentioned, it showed up in Varga's relay around the 47-minute mark. His transmission signal degraded. The exercise parameters don't currently account for that, which means you're not testing how your teams respond to that specific failure mode. The platform was very quiet. Okafor, standing 10 feet back with his team, was watching Elena with an expression that had gone through about 4 different stages in the last 2 minutes. Maddox stepped toward her. "You spent 58 minutes watching my exercise," he said, "and now you're going to stand here and tell me, 'I'm telling you what I observed,'" she said. "That's what I'm here for." "What you're here for," he said, and the word here carried a particular weight, is to observe and document, not to critique my program design in front of my people. You asked me to speak. I asked if you had something to say. I expected, what did you expect? The question landed flat and direct and left no comfortable place to stand. Maddox stopped. He was used to confrontation. He was built for it, in fact, physically, psychologically, professionally. He had been in rooms with generals and agency directors and foreign military commanders and hostile informants and every variation of difficult human being that the special operations world manufactured, and he had never once found himself without a response. He was looking for one now. Senior Chief. Elena's voice dropped, not dramatically, just to the register of something that wasn't performing for an audience. I'm not here to embarrass your program. I'm here because the readiness data from this installation shows a 17% decline in first attempt success rates over the last 6 months. And that number is sitting in a report on someone's desk right now who is making decisions about this program's future. My job is to find out why the number exists and what fixes it. I know my program. I'm sure you do. She closed the notebook. That's why this conversation is going to be useful. That was the moment he shoved her. Not in the briefing hall, not during the debrief, not in private. He did it on the training field, in front of 8 other people, while Okafor's team was still standing 30 feet away watching. It happened fast, the kind of movement that came from reflex rather than decision, from a man whose body had been trained to respond to challenge with force, and whose mind had stopped mediating between the instinct and the action. The heel of his palm connected with her left shoulder. Not a punch, not technically an assault, but a shove, deliberate, hard, meant to physically move her backward from the position she was occupying. She didn't go backward. Her boots scraped against the ground. She absorbed the force and planted, and she stood there. The silence on that platform was absolute. Okafor's hand had moved without his permission to his radio. He caught himself and dropped it back to his side. Portman, who had come down from the command post, stopped walking. Maddox stared at her, and Elena looked at his hand, still raised, knuckles still forward, and then she looked directly into his face. Senior Chief. Her voice was quiet. Not afraid, not theatrical, just quiet, in the way a locked door is quiet. You just made the biggest mistake of your career. He pulled his hand back. Something moved behind his eyes. Not regret, not yet, but something adjacent to recognition. The beginning of understanding that he had crossed a line that existed on paper and in law and in the professional consequences that would follow, regardless of how justified he believed himself to be. But he wasn't going to show that, not here. You want to file a complaint, he said. You know where the JAG office is. I'm not interested in filing a complaint, she said. Then what are you interested in? She looked at him for a long moment, finishing the evaluation. She turned, stepped off the platform, and walked back toward the compound without another word. The people standing on that platform watched her go. Okafor exhaled slowly. Portman glanced at Maddox. Maddox said nothing. I was looking at the ground where her boots had been, at the faint scrape marks in the pale dust where she had absorbed the impact and refused to move. Nobody said anything for a long time. What? The next morning arrived with lower humidity and a slight coastal breeze that would be gone by 1,000 hours. And the mood across the installation had the particular quality of a building where something significant has happened in one room, and everyone in every other room has heard about it, but nobody is saying so directly. Elena ate breakfast at 0600 in the corner of the mess hall, alone, with her notebook open and a cup of coffee that was better than the previous days by marginal degrees. She ate quickly, scrambled eggs, a piece of toast, water, and spent the meal reviewing the notes she'd taken on the exercise. 3 Marines sat down nearby. They didn't speak to her. They didn't make it obvious they were watching her, but they were watching her, in the sideways manner of people who have heard a story and are trying to reconcile it with what they're seeing in front of them. What they were seeing was a woman eating eggs and writing in a notebook. She looked up once, caught the eye of the youngest of them, a kid who couldn't have been older than 22, with corporal's chevrons and the expression of someone who had been awake thinking about something since 0300. She went back to her eggs. He looked at his tray. Portman found her after breakfast at the records office, where she had submitted the access request the day before and had come to collect the documentation she'd asked for. The clerk behind the counter had the expression of someone who had received a phone call he didn't enjoy and was currently unsure whether the authorization code he'd been given overrode the other phone call he'd received telling him to hold that request. Elena had given him 45 seconds to make the decision. He made it at 42. She was carrying the files, radio assessment logs, after-action documentation, the program's 8-week performance metrics, under her arm when Portman fell into step beside her. "Commander." "Gunny, I wanted to—" He stopped, reconsidered, started again. "Yesterday was out of line." "Yes." "He's—" Another pause. "Maddox is good at what he does. I'm not defending what happened." "I know you're not." They walked in silence for a few steps. "What are you actually looking at?" he said. "The evaluation. What specifically are you trying to find?" Elena considered the question, not because it was difficult, but because Portman was asking it in the way that someone asks when they already know part of the answer and want to find out how much the other person knows. "The decline in first attempt readiness scores," she said. 6 months, 17%. That kind of drop in that time window, in a program this established, doesn't happen from general slippage. It happens from something specific. "Like what?" "That's what I'm finding out." "And the shove yesterday." She stopped walking. Portman stopped beside her. "The shove yesterday," she said, "is documented. What happens with it depends on what else I find." She started walking again. Portman watched her go for a moment, then fell back into step. "You didn't flinch," he said. "Not even a little." She didn't answer that. They reached the administrative building. She stopped at the door. "Gunny Portman, the Lance Corporal who fumbled the backup comms card yesterday. Denton." "How long has he been with the unit?" 3 months. "Did he complete the backup protocol course?" "He should have." "I know he should have. Did he?" Portman was quiet for half a second. "I'll check." She went inside. "Well," the answer Portman came back with 4 hours later was not the answer he expected to give. Lance Corporal Kevin Denton had been enrolled in the backup protocol certification course. His name appeared on the roster. His completion date appeared in the system. The problem was that 3 Marines who had been on that same roster, in that same course, on those same completion dates, remembered doing it. Denton didn't. When Portman sat him down in a small room in the training annex and asked him directly, the kid looked at him with the honest confusion of someone who genuinely had no memory of completing a week-long certification course. "Gunny, I thought that was a prerequisite. I thought I was supposed to do it before I transferred in." "And?" "And nobody told me to, so I figured it was handled somehow." Portman kept his face neutral. "When did you get the transfer?" "August 2nd. The course completion record in the system showed August 9th. Portman excused himself, walked to the hallway, and stood there for 30 seconds, doing nothing but breathing. Then he went to find Elena. She was in a small conference room she'd been assigned at the back of the administrative building, with the 8 weeks of documentation spread across the table in 4 separate piles, organized by something that Portman didn't immediately understand until he looked more carefully. She had sorted them by date, but cross-referenced against the readiness scores. The decline didn't begin uniformly. It began at a specific point and then accelerated. "Denton's certification record is falsified," Portman said without preamble. Elena didn't look up from the documents. "Is it the only one?" Portman sat down. "I don't know yet. How many personnel transferred into the program in the last 6 months?" He did the math in his head. 11. "I need their certification records pulled. All of them. And I need the records of the personnel who processed the transfers." Portman looked at her. "You knew." "I suspected," she said. "There's a difference." She turned a page. "A 17% decline in first attempt success rates, concentrated in the last 6 months, with the strongest drop in the units that received new personnel. That pattern has a shape." The shape looked like a certification problem. Certification problems can happen from neglect, from poor training design, or from falsification. She set the page down. "Yesterday, watching Denton freeze on that backup comms card, he didn't freeze because he was slow or underprepared. He froze because he had never seen that card before. You can tell the difference." "If the records are falsified," Portman said carefully, "that's a criminal matter." "Yes," she said. "It is." The conference room was quiet. Outside, the training ground sounds filtered through the window. Radio chatter, a vehicle engine, someone running a drill that involved a lot of counting. "Who processed the August transfers?" she said. Portman looked at her. He already knew what name was going to come out of that file. And from the expression on Elena's face, she was already fairly certain she knew it too. She picked up her pen. "Pull the records, Gunny." Portman stood. At the door, he paused. "Commander, yesterday, on the platform, after he shoved you." He wasn't sure how to finish the sentence. "You didn't look scared." Elena wrote something in the notebook. "I wasn't," she said. "What were you?" She considered that. "Tired," she said finally, "of having to prove it again." Portman left. Elena sat with the documents for another hour. The afternoon light came through the window at a flat angle and made the pages hard to read, but she didn't move to adjust the blinds. She sat with the discomfort of bad light and the worse discomfort of what the numbers in front of her were beginning to confirm. Somewhere in the administrative record of a military training installation, someone had decided that falsifying personnel certifications was worth the risk. The question that sat at the back of her mind, cold and quiet, the question she wasn't ready to ask out loud yet, was who had enough access, enough authority, and enough reason. She looked at the transfer processing records. She found the name, and for the first time that day, her pen stopped moving. Outside, the sun dropped another degree toward the western edge of the compound. The training field went quiet, and in the long shadow of the administrative building, a door opened and closed, and footsteps moved away from it quickly. The footsteps of someone who had been standing near the corridor window for longer than they should have been, listening to a conversation that hadn't been meant for them. The name on the transfer processing record was Lieutenant Commander Greg Halston. Elena sat with that for a moment. Not because it surprised her. The data had been pointing somewhere specific for the last 2 hours, and Halston's name had appeared often enough in the administrative trail that his presence in this particular corner of it was more confirmation than revelation. She sat with it because finding a name is one thing, and understanding what that name means is another, and the gap between those two positions is where the actual work lived. Halston ran the Personnel and Training Coordination Office at Thornfield. He had held the position for 14 months. He was 48 years old, a competent administrator with an unremarkable service record and a reputation among the junior staff for being pleasant and easy to work with and fundamentally uninteresting. Nothing in his visible profile suggested a man who would falsify military certification records, but visible profiles were constructed things. Elena had spent enough time around people who understood that to know exactly how much weight to give one. She photographed the relevant pages with her phone, stacked the documents back into their 4 piles in the same order she'd found them, and locked the conference room door when she left. The hallway outside was empty in the direction of the window. Whoever had been standing near the corridor had been gone long enough that the linoleum had gone quiet and cool again. She noted that and kept moving. She needed to find Portman. She found him in the supply annex behind the main training building, standing over a metal folding table covered in personnel files. He had pulled them himself rather than run the request through the administrative system, which told her he had thought through the same implications she had. 7, he said, without looking up from the files. 7 out of 11 transfer records have completion dates that don't match anything I can verify through training logs, instructor records, or facility booking sheets. 7. Could be 8. One of them I can't confirm either way because the instructor for that block is currently on deployment. Elena set her notebook on the edge of the table. Who signed off on the certification entries? Portman looked at her then. Halston's office. Every one of them. The supply annex had no windows. The light came from 2 rows of fluorescent tubes overhead, one of which flickered with the slow, irregular rhythm of a dying thing. The sound it made, a faint, intermittent electronic stutter, was the only sound in the room for a few seconds. "I need you to not run this through official channels yet," Elena said. Portman's jaw tightened slightly. "Commander, if those records are falsified, I'm obligated. I know what you're obligated. I'm asking you to give me 48 hours before you trigger the formal reporting chain." "Why?" "Because the moment this enters the official reporting chain, the paper trail gets complicated, and people who need to not know about it will know about it within 12 hours. Military installations are not good at containing information." Portman was quiet. "You think Halston knows what you found?" I think someone was standing near the window of that conference room for a period of time this afternoon that they can't explain professionally. She picked up the nearest file from the table. I think 48 hours gives me enough time to understand the shape of this before the shape gets managed by someone else. Portman looked at the table. Then he looked at her. 48 hours, he said. Thank you, Gunny. Don't thank me. If this goes sideways, I'm going to say this conversation happened differently. That's reasonable. She took the file she was holding and left him standing in the flickering light of the supply annex with 7 folders of falsified records and the expression of a man who has just made a decision he isn't entirely sure about. The second day's training exercise was scheduled for 0800, and it was larger than the first. Maddox had designed it as a force-on-force scenario, 2 competing elements, simulated opposing objectives, real-time decision-making under simulated communication stress. The kind of scenario where you learn things that a scripted exercise couldn't teach, because the opposition didn't follow a script. Elena was on the observation platform at 0750. Maddox arrived at 0758 and stood at the far end of the platform without acknowledging her. Portman positioned himself between them, which was probably deliberate. The exercise launched at 0803, 2 minutes behind schedule because one of Bravo Team's radio operators had missed the assembly time and had to be retrieved from the mess hall. Maddox noted the delay with the controlled expression of someone suppressing a response that would have been louder in a different setting. For the first 20 minutes, the scenario ran cleanly. Both elements moved with purpose, communicated efficiently, and executed their initial phase objectives within acceptable time windows. Okafor's element, now designated the Defender Force, held a simulated compound in the north section of the training area. The assault element, led by a Marine Raider staff sergeant named Petra Calloway, moved through the eastern corridor with considerably more tactical discipline than the previous day's exercise had demonstrated. Elena watched. She wrote almost nothing in the first 20 minutes. At the 23-minute mark, the communications degradation event began. This was a different protocol than the previous day. Instead of a clean failure, it was a rolling interference pattern that degraded signal quality gradually and unpredictably, simulating the effect of electronic warfare on a real operational frequency. Calloway's team adapted faster than expected. They shifted to a 3-element spacing protocol that reduced their radio dependency and relied on visual markers between team members, a technique that was correct, efficient, and notably not in the current Thornfield training manual. Elena noticed. She wrote something. Maddox, to his credit, noticed too. She saw him mark something on his clipboard. At the 38-minute mark, the scenario introduced a complication. A third element, 4 personnel playing the role of a civilian presence in the contested area, appeared from the western side of the training zone. The exercise parameters required both competing elements to account for this presence while maintaining their primary objectives. It was the kind of complication that sorted the prepared from the unprepared faster than any direct combat simulation. Okafor's element handled it reasonably. They pulled 2 personnel to manage the civilian corridor without significantly disrupting their defensive posture. It cost them reaction time but preserved the core structure. Calloway's assault element stopped entirely for 47 seconds. 47 seconds was a long time. In real operational terms, it was long enough for a defensive element to reposition, for a sniper to acquire and fire, for a vehicle to breach a perimeter. It was the kind of hesitation that got people killed. Maddox saw it. His radio came up immediately. Calloway, what is your status? A pause on the other end. Not long. 3 seconds. But the kind of 3 seconds where you could hear someone making a decision. Reassessing civilian presence, Senior Chief. Northern movement. Possible interference with primary breach vector. You have 40 seconds to make a decision and move. Another pause. Copy. They moved at the 45-second mark. The scenario ended at the 62-minute mark. It was a technical success for neither element. Calloway's team achieved a partial objective breach. Okafor's team maintained a compromised defensive position. Under scoring criteria, it landed in the category of mutual attrition, which was a polite way of saying both sides lost more than they could afford. Maddox called the debrief. The platform filled with the 2 elements plus support personnel. Somewhere between 20 and 25 people crowded onto a space designed for 12. The heat was already beginning to build, not yet in the range that would affect the radios, but enough to make extended standing uncomfortable. Maddox ran the debrief the way he ran everything, directly, specifically, without any softening of conclusions. He identified Calloway's hesitation by name and time. He walked through Okafor's reaction time cost from the civilian protocol. He covered the communications adaptation Calloway's team had used and acknowledged it was effective. Then he turned to Elena. "Commander Voss? Observations." It was not an invitation. It had the particular tone of a man issuing a challenge while maintaining the technical form of a question. Elena closed her notebook. Staff Sergeant Calloway's team used a 3-element spacing protocol during the interference window that wasn't in your training curriculum. I'd like to know where that came from. Calloway, standing on the left side of the platform, looked at her. Something I picked up on a joint training rotation. Seemed applicable. It was the right call, Elena said. The question is why it's in Staff Sergeant Calloway's personal toolkit and not in the program documentation. She looked at Maddox. That's the kind of institutional knowledge loss that contributes to inconsistency in readiness scores. Maddox said, "My program documentation is current and comprehensive. For the personnel who've been here long enough to absorb the informal knowledge base, yes. For the 7 personnel who transferred in over the last 6 months and were certified through..." She paused, a fraction of a second, a choice. Accelerated processing. The documentation is what they have. And the documentation doesn't have what Calloway knows. The platform was quiet. Portman, standing at the back, was looking at a point somewhere above the horizon. Maddox was looking at her. "Accelerated processing," he said. "That's what I said." Something moved in his face. She watched it move. He was smart enough to hear what she was implying and tactical enough to understand that this was not the venue to have that conversation. "We'll discuss program documentation after the debrief," he said. "Of course." The debrief continued. She didn't push further. She stood on the edge of the platform and watched the Marines absorb the critique of their performance and file it away for the next attempt. The way experienced people absorb and process and move forward. And she thought about the name on the transfer processing record and the person who had been standing near the window and the 48 hours that were now running. After the debrief, Maddox waited until the platform had cleared before he came to where she was standing. He stopped 6 feet away. A conscious choice. He had recalibrated the spatial distance between them, and they both knew why. "You're implying something about the certification records," he said. "I'm doing an evaluation," she said. "That involves reviewing records." "Don't." His voice dropped. Not angry. Something more controlled than anger. "Don't run the careful language with me. Say what you mean, or don't say it." She looked at him. 7 of your 11 transferred personnel were certified through records that I can't verify against any corresponding training activity. The certifications came through Lieutenant Commander Halston's office. That's what I found. That's what I mean. Maddox was very still. "Halston." "Yes." "You're telling me that Halston is running falsified cert records through my program. I'm telling you what the documentation shows. And you didn't come to me with this first. I came to Gunny Portman first because Portman doesn't have a documented assault on a superior officer in the last 48 hours. That landed. Maddox looked at the training ground. "I didn't assault you. You shoved me in front of 30 witnesses." He said nothing for a moment. "Why are you telling me now?" "Because you're going to find out in the next 48 hours regardless. And I'd rather you find out from me than from a chain of command memo that arrives after I've already filed my report." She picked up her notebook from the platform railing. "And because you know this installation better than I do, and if something is happening in the administrative track of your program, you may know something that helps me understand the shape of it. You're asking for my help. I'm offering you the chance to be useful." He looked at her for a long moment. The sun was fully overhead now, flat and merciless, and the shadows on the training ground had shrunk to almost nothing. "Halston transferred in from the Naval Supply Systems Command 14 months ago," he said. "I saw that. He came with a commendation from someone in the Pentagon Logistics Office, name I didn't recognize. I didn't look into it because the commendation was legitimate and his paperwork was clean. Do you remember the name?" "No." "Can you find it?" He said nothing for a moment. "Maybe." She started moving toward the compound. 48 hours, Senior Chief. After that, I file what I have regardless." He watched her walk away. Then he pulled out his phone and made a call. The call Maddox made was to a man named Sergeant Major Theo Briggs, retired, who currently lived in an unincorporated area of Nevada and spent most of his time fishing and occasionally answering questions for people who had served with him and needed the kind of information that didn't live in any accessible database. Briggs picked up on the second ring, which meant he was awake and near his phone, which meant he wasn't fishing. Maddox. Briggs, I need a name checked. What kind of name? Pentagon Logistics. Someone who signed a commendation for a naval officer about 14 months ago. Officer named Halston. The commendation came from Supply Systems Command. A pause. That's a specific ask. I know. You want to tell me what this is about? No. Another pause, longer this time. Give me a few hours. Maddox hung up and stood on the empty training platform for another minute. The heat was significant now, pressing down on everything with the indifferent weight of desert afternoon. He took off his cover and ran a hand over his head and thought about Halston. Pleasant, uninteresting Halston, who knew everyone's name and always had the personnel files ready, and had been sitting 14 months in the middle of the administrative infrastructure of Maddox's program, like something waiting quietly to be noticed. He thought about the 17% decline. He thought about Denton freezing on the backup comms card. He thought about 7 out of 11 transfer records with no corresponding training activity. And then, underneath all of it, like a sound he'd been hearing for weeks without identifying its source, he thought about the 3 supply shipments that had arrived at the Thornfield Training Annex in the last 5 months, that had been processed through Halston's office and had contained equipment quantities that didn't match the training manifests. He had noticed that, had meant to look into it, had been busy with the exercise redesign and the readiness assessment prep and the general overwhelming volume of running a major training program with insufficient administrative support. He put his cover back on. He went to find Portman. Portman was back in the supply annex when Maddox arrived, still with the files, though he had reorganized them into a different arrangement that suggested he had been working through the data rather than just sitting with it. He looked up when Maddox came through the door, and the expression on his face was the carefully neutral expression of a man who has been caught between 2 moving objects and is calculating which direction to step. Maddox said, "Tell me about the supply manifest." Portman set down the file he was holding. "Which one?" "The last 5 months. Halston's office processed 3 equipment deliveries for the training annex. I want to know if those quantities reconcile with what we actually have in inventory." Portman was quiet for a moment. "I've been thinking about the same thing," he said. "And?" "I haven't pulled those records yet." "Pull them now." Portman pulled them. It took 20 minutes, cross-referencing the delivery manifests against the current inventory logs. And at the end of the 20 minutes, they had a table of numbers that told a story that neither of them particularly wanted to hear. Across 3 separate deliveries, the Thornfield Training Annex had been invoiced for equipment with a total value of approximately $240,000. The invoices were signed, the deliveries were logged, the administrative chain was clean. The actual equipment in the inventory was worth somewhere between $60,000 and $80,000 less than what the invoices claimed. The discrepancy wasn't in the expensive items, not the radios or the optics, or the specialized gear that got counted carefully. It was in the consumables. The batteries, the training ammunition, the replacement components, the supply chain items that moved in bulk and got counted by weight and volume rather than by individual unit. The items that were hardest to audit. Maddox sat down. He was not a man who sat down in professional settings. He stood, always, planted, physical, present. Sitting was what you did when you were processing something that required a moment. "He's been skimming the supply chain," Portman said. "The certifications were cover," Maddox said. "If you're falsifying cert records to get unqualified personnel through transfer processing, there's a reason. If you need unqualified personnel to not notice discrepancies in the inventory, there's a reason for that too." Portman sat down across from him. "The people who should be catching the inventory problems during daily operations," Portman said slowly, "are the people who transferred in over the last 6 months. And the people who transferred in over the last 6 months," Maddox finished, "are the people who were certified by records that don't match any actual training." The fluorescent tube above them kept flickering. Neither of them spoke for a moment. How much of this did Voss already know? Portman asked. She knew about the certifications. I don't know if she connected the supply chain. Maddox looked at the inventory table. She's going to now. Should we tell her? She's already working it, 48 hours before she files. That's not much time. No, Maddox said. It isn't. He stood back up, looked at the inventory numbers one more time, thought about $240,000 worth of invoices and $60,000 to $80,000 worth of missing equipment and a man in a personnel office who had been pleasant and uninteresting for 14 months. Get me Halston's Pentagon commendation letter, he said. The physical file, not the digital record. Whatever's in the paper archive. Why the paper archive? Because whoever taught Halston to do this taught him to clean his digital trail. Paper is harder to clean because people forget it exists. Portman was already moving toward the filing cabinet. Well, the physical archive for Thornfield's personnel records was housed in a narrow room at the back of the administrative building. A room that smelled of old paper and dust and the particular staleness of spaces that received fluorescent light and recycled air and nothing else. Filing cabinets ran floor to ceiling along 3 walls. The organizational system had evolved over 40 years into something that was technically logical and practically incomprehensible to anyone who hadn't worked with it for more than 18 months. Portman had worked with it for 3 years. It still took him 40 minutes. He found Halston's commendation letter in a folder that had been misfiled. Not dramatically, not in a way that would suggest deliberate tampering, just the ordinary misfiling that happened in a 40-year archive when someone pulled a folder and put it back in the wrong slot. The kind of mistake that a file might sit in for months before anyone noticed. The letter was on official stationery. Portman read it once. Then he read it again. The commending officer's signature at the bottom was a Rear Admiral named William Carver from the Defense Logistics Agency's Procurement Oversight Division. The name meant nothing to Portman. He photographed it and sent the image to Maddox. Maddox's response came back in under 3 minutes. Call Briggs. Give him this name too. Elena was in the conference room when Maddox knocked. She had been there for 2 hours, working through a different layer of the documentation. The individual readiness assessment records for each of the 7 personnel whose certifications were in question, cross-referencing their field performance metrics against the broader unit trend data to build a picture of exactly how deep the capability gap ran. It was worse than the aggregate numbers suggested. 2 of the 7 had participated in real-world support operations in the last 4 months. Not combat operations, but live coordination exercises with active military units. Events where their training status was assumed and their performance was relied on. She was writing down the implications of that when Maddox knocked. She said, "Come in." He came in and stood across the table from her and set his phone down with the screen showing Portman's photograph of the commendation letter. She looked at it. "Carver," she said. "Defense Logistics Agency. Procurement Oversight." He pulled out the chair across from her and sat in it, which told her something about where he was. The supply manifests are short by somewhere between $60,000 and $80,000. The discrepancy is in consumables across 3 deliveries over 5 months. Elena set her pen down. "Halston isn't the origin point," she said. "No. He's the installation-level executor. Someone upstream is running this. Carver's office has oversight authority over Supply Systems Command. If he's connected to Halston's transfer, it's a supply chain fraud operation," Elena said. She said it flatly, without emphasis, the way you say something when you've arrived at a conclusion, and the conclusion is ugly, but it's not a surprise. Falsify the certifications to place personnel who won't catch inventory discrepancies. Skim the consumables over multiple deliveries at multiple installations, probably, not just here. Keep the amount small enough per site that no single audit flags it. Run it through a legitimate administrative channel and collect the difference. Maddox was looking at the table. "Multiple installations," he said. "Thornfield's readiness scores dropped 17%. You think Thornfield is the only installation with a 6-month personnel and readiness problem?" He was quiet. "How long has this been running?" he said. "I don't know yet. The records I have go back 8 months. But if Carver's been in that oversight role for longer than 8 months, he has. I looked it up. 31 months. Elena wrote something in her notebook. The fluorescent light in this room didn't flicker. It just hummed, steady and indifferent, while the 2 of them sat with the shape of something that was considerably larger than a training program readiness decline at a single Marine installation. "I have to expand the scope of the evaluation," Elena said. That means contacting Naval Special Warfare Command directly and requesting authorization to pull records from the program at the regional level. That'll trigger flags. I know. If Carver has people watching for flags, I know, she said again. Maddox looked at her. Then you're in the open the moment you make that contact. Yes. And you're okay with that. She looked up from the notebook. Are you going to ask me again if I'm scared? He shook his head. I'm asking if you have a plan. Elena was quiet for a moment. I have the beginning of one, she said. Outside, the sun had finally dropped low enough to stop coming through the western windows, and the conference room had gone into the dim, flat light of late afternoon. Somewhere across the compound, a vehicle engine turned over and then cut out. A radio crackled briefly and then went silent. And on the other side of the administrative building, in an office with the door closed and the blinds drawn against the evening light, Lieutenant Commander Greg Halston was looking at his computer screen with an expression that no one who described him as pleasant and uninteresting had ever seen on his face. On the screen was a flagged access notification. Someone had pulled the paper archive files in the personnel records room 43 minutes ago. Halston sat very still. Then he picked up his phone and placed a call that went through 2 routed numbers before it connected. When the person on the other end answered, Halston said 3 words. She found it. Halston's call lasted 4 minutes and 11 seconds. He didn't know that Elena had placed a passive signal intercept on the administrative building's outgoing line at 1640 that afternoon. A small device no larger than a USB drive, plugged into the junction panel in the utility corridor behind the records room, running a frequency capture protocol that she hadn't used since a forward operating base in a country whose name still appeared nowhere in her official service record. She hadn't known for certain she would need it. She had put it there because she had learned a long time ago, and at considerable cost, that the difference between prepared and unprepared was usually measured in the window between when a situation changed and when you realized it had changed. Halston's call told her the window had just closed. She was in the conference room when the intercept pinged her phone. She plugged in a single earpiece, played the audio file, and listened to 3 minutes and 40 seconds of a man trying to sound calmer than he was while explaining to someone he clearly feared that an outside evaluator had accessed the paper archive. The voice on the other end of the call was male, controlled, and said almost nothing that was directly incriminating. Just a sequence of short responses that told Halston to document the access through official channels and to make no further contact until instructed. The 4th voice response, at the 3-minute 50-second mark, said this: "The Briggs Protocol. You know what that means." Then the call ended. Elena pulled the earpiece out. She sat with the phrase for a moment. Not the Briggs that Maddox had contacted. That was coincidence of name only, and she noted it and set it aside. Whatever the Briggs Protocol meant in Halston's operational context, it had produced an immediate and observable effect. Within 20 minutes of the call ending, the administrative building's internal network logged 3 separate file access events from Halston's workstation, all of them in the personnel records system, all of them touching the transfer documentation for the 7 flag certifications. He was cleaning the digital trail. She had expected this, which was why she had photographed the physical files before Portman pulled them, and why the photographs were currently sitting on a server that had nothing to do with Thornfield's internal network. But the act of cleaning told her something important about the timeline she was working with. Halston had been told to move fast, which meant someone had decided that waiting was no longer safe. She called Maddox. He picked up on the first ring. "Halston made a call," she said. "He's cleaning the digital records right now." A pause. "How do you know about the call? Does it matter?" A shorter pause. "No. What do you need?" "I need to know if Briggs, your contact, has come back with anything on Carver." He called 20 minutes ago. Carver's name appears in 3 procurement audits from the last 30 months, all of them flagged for irregularities, and all of them subsequently closed without finding. The officer who signed off on the closures was a captain in the Navy Inspector General's office named Waverly. Waverly is connected to Carver. That's what Briggs thinks. He can't prove it yet. He doesn't need to prove it tonight. I need him to keep pulling. She stood up from the conference table and began gathering the documents into her bag. I need to move the physical files out of this building. Where? Somewhere that isn't connected to Halston's administrative reach. Can you get me access to the off-compound storage facility at the Eastern Annex? That's a special operations restricted area. I know what it is. Another pause. Longer this time. I'll have Portman meet you at the east fence in 20 minutes, Maddox said. Thank you. She ended the call, finished packing the bag, and took one more look around the conference room. The table was clear. The chairs were as she'd found them. The window latch was closed. Nothing looked different from how it had looked when she arrived, which was exactly what she needed. She turned off the light and walked out into the hallway. 3 doors down, behind the closed door of his office, Halston was still at his computer. She could see the light under the door. She kept walking. The eastern annex at Thornfield sat beyond the main compound fence line, accessible through a vehicle gate that required a coded entry sequence that changed on a 72-hour rotation. It was used primarily for specialized equipment storage, optics, communications gear, sensitive ordnance components, and was staffed during the day by 2 personnel from the Special Operations Support Element. At 2100 hours on a Tuesday, it was empty except for the motion-activated security lighting that clicked on when Portman's vehicle pulled through the gate. Elena was already there, on foot, having come through a service access path along the perimeter that Portman hadn't known existed and tactfully chose not to ask about. They moved the physical files into a locked storage cabinet in the back of the annex's main room, and Elena added a padlock from her own kit that had nothing to do with Thornfield's key management system. You carry a padlock, Portman said. I carry several things that have turned out to be useful. He looked at the bag she'd set on the equipment table. It was the same canvas bag she'd been carrying since she arrived, worn at the handles, slightly overfull. He'd assumed it contained notebooks and documentation. I was revising that assumption. Halston's cleaning the digital files, she told him. He got a call from someone connected to Carver. They're accelerating. Portman leaned against the cabinet. What does accelerating mean for us? It means my 48-hour window just became significantly shorter, and it means that whatever they're planning to do to neutralize this situation, they're planning to do it soon. Neutralize the situation, Portman repeated. You mean the records? I mean the records and the people who've seen them. The security lighting hummed overhead. Portman looked at her. Are you telling me we're in actual danger? I'm telling you that people who run supply chain fraud operations at this scale don't get scared and do nothing. They get scared and make problems disappear. Usually through official channels first, an investigation derailed, a transfer order, an evaluation report discredited. She paused. And if the official channels don't work fast enough, through other means. Other means? Portman said. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. What do you want me to do? Keep doing your job exactly as normal tomorrow morning. Run the exercise, process the routine paperwork, eat in the mess hall. Don't approach Halston's office and don't pull any additional records through the official system. And you? I'm going to make a call tonight that I should have made 2 days ago. The call she made at 2147 from the Eastern Annex, on a phone that was not the phone she used for anything else, went to a direct line at the Naval Criminal Investigative Service field office in San Diego. The agent who answered was a woman named Special Agent Donna Reyes, and the conversation lasted 11 minutes, and at the end of it Reyes said 2 things. The first was, this is going to require authorization from above my pay grade. The second was, don't file anything through the evaluation report channel. Not yet. Give me until tomorrow morning. Elena said she could do that. She ended the call, sat in the quiet of the Eastern Annex for a while, and then began writing in her notebook. Not documentation this time, but a sequence of events laid out in chronological order, with the gaps marked clearly and the connections between established facts drawn as lines rather than conclusions. The picture that emerged was not complicated. It was large, and it was deliberate, and it had been running for long enough that it had developed the comfortable confidence of something that has never been seriously threatened. She thought about the phrase she'd heard on the intercepted call, the Briggs Protocol. She thought about what a protocol meant in this context, not a person, but a set of procedures, a response sequence, something that had been planned in advance for the specific situation of an external evaluation getting too close to the mechanism. She thought about what that response sequence probably looked like. Then she packed up her notebook, turned off the light in the Eastern Annex, and went back to her quarters across the compound. And she slept for 4 hours because she had learned, also a long time ago, that decisions made on no sleep were the kind of decisions you spent years afterward wishing you could take back. At 0340, her phone woke her. It was Maddox. "Get to the command center," he said. "Now." She was dressed in 40 seconds. The Thornfield Command Center occupied the northeast corner of the main compound building, a room about the size of a large classroom, lined with communication equipment, display screens, and the various technological infrastructure that allowed the installation to coordinate with external military operations. It was staffed around the clock by a rotating duty crew, and at 0340 it contained the duty watch officer, 2 radio technicians, and Ryan Maddox, who was standing in front of the main display screen with his arms crossed and his jaw set in a way that suggested he had been standing like that for a while and was not finding it productive. The main display screen was showing a system alert. Elena read it. Then she read it again. The alert was from the base communications infrastructure, specifically from the relay station that connected Thornfield's internal communication network to the wider regional military communications system. The relay had been experiencing intermittent failures for the last 40 minutes. The failures weren't uniform or random. They were targeted, specific frequency channels, specific time windows, a pattern that a casual observer might read as equipment malfunction. A less casual observer would read it as deliberate interference. "When did this start?" she asked. "Approximately 0300, the duty watch officer said. He was a young captain named Reardon, calm enough but clearly aware that something was happening that exceeded the parameters of a routine. Initial readings looked like a standard relay fault. I called Senior Chief Maddox at 0315 when the second failure sequence didn't match any known fault pattern." "The pattern," Elena said. "Show me the signal log." Reardon pulled it up on the secondary screen. Elena looked at the signal log. Her expression didn't change, but something in the room changed anyway. The quality of the silence shifted in the specific way that it shifts when someone who knows what they're looking at sees something, and everyone else can tell they've seen something, but nobody knows yet what it is. "This is an equipment failure," she said. "I know that," Maddox said. "This is an external jamming signal. It's running on a rotating frequency protocol that's designed to look like cascade hardware failure, but the rotation intervals are too regular. Hardware failures don't space themselves at 4-minute intervals." Reardon looked at the log. "A jamming signal," he said. "From where?" "From something close enough to affect the relay but far enough to look like it's inside the system. A vehicle, probably, or a position on the outer perimeter." Elena turned to Maddox. "Who has access to that kind of equipment?" "Multiple entities," he said. "On short notice, at 0300, positioned against a marine installation." He looked at her. "Someone with military-grade jamming capability," he said. "Someone who had access to the Briggs protocol." The room was quiet. Reardon looked between them. "Someone want to explain to me what's happening?" "Someone is trying to isolate this installation's communications," Elena said, "which means they're planning to do something in the next window before we restore contact with the regional network." She turned to Maddox. "What's the manual backup for external communication?" "Satellite phone array in the equipment room, off the main network." "Is it currently operational?" Maddox looked at one of the radio technicians. The technician pulled up a status screen. "Shows operational," he said, "but I can't verify without an outgoing test." "Make the test," Elena said. "Now." The technician looked at Reardon. Reardon looked at Maddox. Maddox said, "Do it." The technician reached for the secondary console. The main screen went dark. Not a gradual dimming, an immediate, complete system drop. Every display in the command center lost power simultaneously. The overhead lights stayed on, running on the building's separate circuit, but every electronic system in the room, every screen, every radio console, every active terminal, dropped to black at the same instant. Reardon said something under his breath. One of the radio technicians was already on his feet, moving to the equipment bay at the back of the room where the manual override systems were housed. The second technician was reaching for the landline backup phone. The landline produced no dial tone. Maddox was looking at Elena. She was already at the main console, which was dark, running her hands along the underside of the primary control panel with the practiced efficiency of someone who knows where the manual access points are on a system she had never been in front of before in her life, or appeared never to have been in front of before. "There's a secondary junction panel," she said, "behind the left equipment rack." Reardon said, "How do you know that?" She didn't answer. She moved to the left equipment rack and pulled it away from the wall. It was on wheels and moved with the reluctance of something heavy and infrequently shifted. And behind it was a gray metal panel with a handle and a manual release lever. She opened it. Inside was a nest of cables and connection nodes and a manual bypass system that would restore partial communication function independent of the main network infrastructure if it was configured correctly. The configuration was not labeled. Elena looked at the panel for 2 seconds. Then she began working it. Her hands moved fast and without hesitation, not frantically, but with the focused speed of someone executing a procedure they have run before. She pulled 2 cables and reconnected them to different junction points. She reached past a circuit block and manually set 3 toggle switches to positions that were not their default. She found a connection node in the lower right quadrant of the panel that had a secondary port, and she pulled a short cable from inside her jacket, a cable she had been carrying apparently for exactly this kind of moment, and connected it to the port. Maddox watched her. He said nothing. His face was doing something complicated. At the 40-second mark, one of the secondary screens in the command center flickered. At the 51st mark, it came back online. Partial system, a fraction of the communication capacity of the full network, degraded signal quality, limited channel access. But functional. Enough to make contact with the outside. The radio technician exhaled. Reardon stared at the screen. "How did you—" he started. "Senior Chief Maddox." Elena's voice cut through the room. She was still at the panel, one hand on the junction block. "Get Special Agent Donna Reyes at NCIS San Diego on whatever communication channel we have operational right now. Tell her the timeline has moved up. Tell her we need a field team at Thornfield tonight, not tomorrow morning." Maddox didn't move for 1 second, just 1 second. Then he said, "Reardon, you heard her." Reardon moved to the secondary console. Elena closed the panel and pushed the equipment rack back toward the wall, and she stood there for a moment with both hands flat against the metal rack and her eyes on the floor. And she breathed just once, deeper than normal, the kind of breath that comes from the precise intersection of physical exertion and controlled adrenaline. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then Maddox said quietly, so that only she could hear, "That bypass configuration. Where did you learn that?" She looked at him. "Forward Operating Base," she said. "Kandahar Province, 2019. Communications went down during a compound clearance operation, and we had 3 minutes before the backup team lost our position." He held her gaze. "You were in Kandahar in 2019. For a time. In what capacity?" She picked up her notebook from the console where she'd set it when she came in. "The capacity that isn't in my official service record," she said. Maddox looked at her for a long moment, the expression of a man who has just understood something he should have understood earlier and is making the specific adjustment that requires, recalibrating not just the information but the whole architecture of assumption he had built around a person. He looked like he had something to say. Before he could say it, Reardon's voice came from the secondary console. "Senior Chief, I have NCIS San Diego on the line." Elena moved toward the console. "Special Agent Reyes," she said, "we have a communications attack on the Thornfield installation. I need to know if your authorization came through." The voice on the other end was clipped and alert. Someone who had clearly not been asleep. "2 hours ago," Reyes said. "Field team is already mobile. The ETA to your location is 90 minutes. We may have a situation developing on the perimeter before they arrive." "What kind of situation?" Elena looked at Maddox. "Someone used military-grade jamming equipment to isolate this installation tonight. That means they have assets in the field. That means this is not just a fraud operation with a paper trail. This has an operational component we haven't fully mapped yet. Can you hold the installation for 90 minutes? Elena looked at Maddox. He heard the question. He turned to Reardon. "Wake up the duty response element. I want 12 personnel armed and positioned at the outer perimeter within 15 minutes. Nobody talks to anyone outside this room about why." Reardon was on the radio before Maddox finished the sentence. "We can hold it," Elena said into the phone. "Stay on this line," Reyes said. Elena didn't put the phone down. She walked to the command center's small window, wire-reinforced glass, too narrow for practical observation, but enough to see the lit perimeter path outside. And she looked out at the darkness of the Thornfield compound at 03:58 in the morning, at the lights along the fence line and the shadows between the buildings and the empty training ground in the distance, and she thought about what it meant that someone had moved assets into the field tonight. Not next week. Not after the official investigation was filed. Tonight. Which meant the Briggs Protocol wasn't just a defensive measure. It was a contingency for making sure that the evidence and the people who had seen it didn't survive long enough to matter. She thought about the supply annex at the eastern fence and the padlocked cabinet inside it. She thought about the 7 personnel files and the falsified certifications and the $80,000 in missing consumables. She thought about Halston, still in his office as of 3 hours ago, cleaning a digital trail that was already less important than whoever was sitting in a vehicle somewhere near the perimeter with military-grade jamming equipment and a protocol that had a name. And then she stopped thinking about all of that, because the perimeter lights on the northern fence line went out. All of them. Not a rolling failure, a simultaneous cut. The lights dropped together the way lights drop when the circuit feeding them is severed at the source, not when bulbs burn out in sequence. She stepped back from the window. "Reyes," she said into the phone. "Northern fence perimeter lights just went down. Single circuit cut. They're moving." From across the room, Maddox was already at the door. "Reardon, tell the duty element, northern perimeter, now." The command center erupted into the specific controlled chaos of professionals responding to a real threat. Not panic, but the compression of multiple simultaneous actions into a tight time window, everyone moving fast and with purpose and with the particular quality of focus that comes from training, meeting, and actual situation. Elena set the phone on the console, speaker mode, and pulled her jacket tighter. Maddox was at the door. He looked at her. "You're staying in here," he said. She looked back at him. "No," she said. "I'm not." He read her face. Then he opened the door. They went out together into the dark of the Thornfield compound, toward the northern fence line and whatever was moving in the shadows on the other side of it, and the command center behind them filled with the voice of Special Agent Reyes on the open line, talking to her mobile field team, and the static of a compromised radio network fighting to stay alive, and the quiet of a base that didn't yet know what was coming through its perimeter. The night was very still. Above the fence line, the stars were hard and clear and indifferent to everything happening below them, and the only sounds were boots on hardpack and the distant thrum of a vehicle engine that cut out abruptly somewhere beyond the northern wire, in the specific silence of something that has just decided to stop announcing itself. The vehicle engine that had gone silent beyond the northern wire didn't stay silent. It came back at a different pitch, lower, a diesel running without headlights, moving parallel to the fence line rather than toward it, which was the kind of tactical decision that told Elena 2 things simultaneously. Whoever was out there knew the perimeter layout well enough to avoid the vehicle gate approach, and they weren't planning to come through the fence at the northern sector. They were using the noise as direction, pulling attention north while the actual entry point was somewhere else. She grabbed Maddox's arm. He had already stopped walking. "That's a feint," she said. "East," he said. They both turned. The eastern perimeter, the side closest to the annex, closest to the locked cabinet, closest to the physical files, was dark in the specific way of a sector that had been overlooked in the initial response deployment. Reardon had sent the duty element north. Standard response to a northern perimeter light failure. Correct. Textbook. Exactly what someone familiar with Thornfield's response protocols would anticipate. Maddox keyed his radio. "Reardon, split the element. 4 personnel to the eastern perimeter fence, sector 7 through 9. Now." A burst of static. Then Reardon's voice, slightly breathless. "Copy, Senior Chief. Moving." They were already moving themselves, cutting across the compound interior at a run, parallel to the main building, toward the eastern annex vehicle path. The ground was uneven in the dark, the hardpack broken up by drainage channels and equipment tie-down anchors, and Elena hit one of the anchor posts at the 300-meter mark with her left shin hard enough to stagger, absorbed it without stopping, and kept running. The eastern annex came into view. The security lighting was still on. That was the first wrong thing. If someone had cut power to the northern fence lights as a diversion, the eastern annex lights should have been part of the same operation, cut simultaneously to degrade the response. The fact that they were still on meant either the operation was less coordinated than she'd estimated, or the eastern approach was the secondary target and the lights were still on because whoever was coming hadn't arrived yet. She slowed. Maddox slowed beside her. They were 40 meters from the annex building, in the shadow of the equipment storage wall, and the only sounds were their own breathing and the distant radio chatter from the duty element moving north and the high, thin sound of the desert wind coming off the flats east of the installation. "One vehicle on the north perimeter," she said, keeping her voice low. "The people who came through the east aren't in a vehicle." Maddox scanned the fence line. "On foot," he said. 2, maybe 3. They'd come over the wire at a low point between sectors 8 and 9. The security camera coverage has a dead angle there. About 40 meters of fence that the Eastern Annex camera doesn't cover because the equipment rack in front of the camera housing was installed 18 months ago and nobody adjusted the mount. Maddox looked at her. "You walked my perimeter." "Day 1, she said, "when I arrived at 0650. He was quiet for 1 second. Then, "The dead angle puts them between the wire and the annex service door." "Yes. Which means they're already inside the perimeter." "Probably." He keyed the radio again. "Reardon, Eastern Annex service entrance. Do not approach from the main path. Come in from the north equipment yard side. Acknowledge." Static. Then, "Acknowledged. 2 minutes." 2 minutes was either enough time or it wasn't. Elena moved. She went wide left, away from the main annex approach path, and into the narrow gap between the equipment storage wall and the perimeter fence, moving fast and low through a space that was barely shoulder width. Maddox went right toward the annex vehicle bay entrance, which gave him an angle on the service door from the opposite side. The service door was already open. She saw it from her angle. The door was ajar by 6 inches, the interior light of the annex showing through the gap as a thin yellow line against the dark exterior. She stopped, controlled her breathing, listened. Inside the annex, movement, more than one person, not trying to be completely silent, but managing noise with the practiced economy of people who have done this kind of work before. The sound of a cabinet being examined. Metal on metal, something being tried against the padlock she had placed on the storage cabinet. They were at the files. Elena looked across the space to where Maddox should have been at the vehicle bay entrance. She couldn't see him, which meant he had positioned himself against the bay wall, which meant he had a door he could come through. She had a door she could come through. The question was timing. She pulled the service door open and went in. The annex interior was exactly as she had left it. Equipment racks, the storage cabinet against the back wall, the metal folding table still in the center of the room. 2 men in dark civilian clothing were at the cabinet. One was working on the padlock with a bolt cutter. The other was facing the service door with his back to the table, and he turned at the sound of Elena entering. He was big. Not military big in the way that Maddox was military big. This was the size that came from a different kind of life, the kind of size that presented itself as a problem to be solved. He moved toward her. She let him come 3 steps, and then she moved inside his reach, used his own forward momentum, and directed him sideways into the metal edge of the equipment rack. The impact was significant. He hit the rack with his shoulder and right temple and went down to one knee, making a sound that was less a word than a response to sudden pain. The man at the cabinet turned. He still had the bolt cutters. The vehicle bay door crashed open. Maddox came through it. What followed was brief, loud, and conclusively ugly in the way that real physical confrontations always were. Nothing clean about it. Nobody moved with precision. The 3-minute fight that the annex contained was 2 experienced people, and 2 people who were capable but had not expected the response to come from both directions simultaneously. The man with the bolt cutters swung them at Maddox. Maddox took the hit across his left forearm, blocked rather than dodged, and responded by driving the man backward into the cabinet hard enough to dent the metal door. The cabinet didn't open. The padlock held. Elena's man had found his feet and was moving at her again, this time with more awareness of the mistake he'd made the first time. And what followed was 30 seconds of controlled grinding work that involved a folding table being knocked sideways and Elena taking a hit to her right shoulder that she would feel for the next 2 weeks, and the man eventually going down face first on the annex floor with his arm at an angle that made further participation impractical. Silence. Maddox had the bolt cutter man against the wall with both the man's wrists pinned. Elena stood over her man. They were both breathing hard. Outside, she could hear Reardon's element approaching. "Clear," she called. "What?" The NCIS field team arrived at 0531. 4 vehicles, 8 agents, Special Agent Reyes in the lead car, a woman in her mid-40s with short, gray-streaked hair, and the particular efficiency of someone who runs toward problems rather than away from them. She was through the compound gate before the vehicle fully stopped, and she found Elena in the command center at the secondary console, still on the open line she'd started 40 minutes ago, surrounded by Maddox and Reardon, and two of the duty element personnel and the collected documentation from the locked cabinet that was now spread across the available surfaces. The two men from the annex were in flex cuffs in the equipment bay, guarded by a Marine corporal who had been told nothing except to watch them. Reyes looked at the room, then she looked at Elena. "You look like you've been fighting." "I have." "I see that." Reyes looked at the documentation spread across the consoles. "Are those the certification records?" "Physical copies. The originals in the system have been altered. Halston accessed the digital files at approximately 2200 last night. These are photographs of the paper archive taken before the alterations." Reyes moved to the nearest stack. "And those two in the equipment bay?" "They came over the eastern perimeter fence at approximately 0430 and attempted to access a secured storage cabinet containing physical evidence." Elena paused. "They were not military. Civilian contractor types. The one in the gray jacket was carrying a phone with a two-way encrypted application that I've seen used by private security firms. Names? No identification on either of them." Reyes was already pulling on examination gloves. "Where's Halston?" "His quarters," Maddox said from the doorway. "I had Portman sit on the building at 0340 when this started." "He's still there?" "As of 15 minutes ago." "Good." Reyes looked at one of her agents. "Go get him. Official detention, document everything." She turned back to the room. "Senior Chief Maddox, I need a formal statement from you about the supply manifest discrepancies, and I need it in writing today." Maddox said, "I'll have it ready by 0900. 0800. 0800, he said, without argument. Reyes pulled up a chair at the main console. "Commander Voss, walk me through it from the beginning, everything in order from the moment you identified the first discrepancy." Elena sat down across from her. She talked for 40 minutes. Halston didn't resist. That was the thing nobody in the compound expected, though perhaps they should have. A man who had run a quiet administrative fraud for the better part of 2 years was not, by definition, a man built for physical confrontation. He opened his quarters door when the NCIS agent knocked, and he looked at the badge and the formal detention language, and something in his face went through several stages in the space of about 4 seconds before settling into the blankness of a decision made. He said, "I want a lawyer." That was all he said for the next 3 hours. It was enough. The request established the formal record. It triggered the chain of notifications that Reyes needed to escalate the investigation to the Defense Logistics Agency level. It also, incidentally, confirmed to everyone watching that Halston understood exactly what he was being detained for, which was its own kind of answer. By 0900, Thornfield was a different installation than it had been 12 hours earlier. 2 NCIS agents had secured Halston's office and begun the process of extracting everything from his computer systems, including the alterations he'd made to the certification records, alterations that, as it turned out, were not as clean as he'd intended because digital files carry timestamps and metadata that the casual editor doesn't fully understand, and the timestamps told a clear story about what had been changed and when. The 2 men from the annex had been identified through fingerprints as former military contractors with employment histories that ran through 3 private security firms, all of which had connections to a parent company in Northern Virginia that shared a registered address with 2 other entities currently under separate federal investigation for procurement fraud. Reyes briefed Elena on this in the conference room at 0930. "Carver's network," Elena said. "We think so. We're not there yet on the paper trail, but the registered address connection is solid enough to get us a federal subpoena for the parent company records." Reyes had a legal pad covered in notes. "The supply manifest discrepancies at Thornfield. How confident are you in the 60 to 80,000 figure?" "Portman ran the reconciliation twice. The number is accurate for Thornfield. I can't speak to other installations." "Other installations?" Reyes made a note. "What's your basis for thinking this extends beyond Thornfield?" "Carver's oversight authority covers 14 installations in the western region. The Briggs Protocol, the response sequence that was triggered last night, was too well organized for an operation running at a single site. The contractor assets that came through the eastern fence had a specific target and a specific approach route. That level of preparation for a single fraud site doesn't make economic sense. Reyes looked at her notes. 14 installations, she said. That's his authority footprint. Not all of them will have been active sites, but more than one. If it's even 3 or 4, we're looking at a 7-figure fraud total. Conservatively, Elena said. Reyes put her pen down. Commander, I'm going to ask you something directly, and I'd appreciate a direct answer. All right. The bypass configuration you used on the command center's communications panel last night. Captain Reardon says you accessed a secondary junction system that isn't in any Thornfield infrastructure documentation. He says you executed the configuration from memory in under 60 seconds without any reference materials. Elena said nothing. That's not a skill that comes from standard Naval Special Warfare Command training, Reyes said. No, Elena agreed. Where does it come from? Elena looked at the table. Then she looked up. There's a classification level on my service record, she said. You can request access through the appropriate channels. What you'll find there will answer your question. I'm asking you to answer it now. And I'm telling you that the answer exists in a classified file that I'm not authorized to discuss in this setting. A pause. What I will tell you is that the work I did before this evaluation assignment required me to develop skills that aren't in any standard curriculum. Some of those skills became relevant last night. That's the extent of what I can say here. Reyes held her gaze for a moment. Fair enough, she said finally, and picked up her pen. Maddox found Elena at 1100, outside, on the eastern side of the main building where there was a narrow strip of shade and a concrete barrier that served as an informal bench. She was sitting on the barrier with her jacket off, and her left forearm was resting on her knee, and she was looking at it in the specific way that someone looks at something that hurts more than they've let on. He sat down beside her, not at the opposite end of the barrier, close enough to speak quietly. He looked at her arm. The forearm was bruised from mid-wrist to elbow, the impact mark from where the man with the bolt cutters had connected during the annex fight, when she had been on the other side of the room and caught it at an angle rather than a direct block. It had gone from red to purple in the hours since. That needs to be looked at, he said. It's bruised. It might be cracked. It's bruised, she said again. I know the difference. He didn't argue. They sat for a moment. Outside the installation fence, a military transport was moving down the access road, its engine loud in the desert quiet. A dust cloud followed it. Then it was gone, and the quiet came back. In the annex last night, Maddox said, the way you moved, the way you assessed the situation before you went in. He stopped, started again. I've trained and worked alongside a lot of people in 22 years. I know you have. I've seen what special operations training produces. I've been through it myself. What you did in there, that's not evaluation work. That's not advisory training. That's operational. Yes, she said. You've run operational work. Yes. Active operations. Yes. He was quiet. Why are you here? He said. Not aggressively. The aggression was gone. Had been going since the annex, was now completely absent from how he said things to her. An officer with your background, running a training program readiness evaluation at a domestic installation. That's not where you put someone with operational field experience. Elena looked at the fence line. I requested this assignment, she said. Why? She picked up her jacket from the concrete beside her. Because 18 months ago, I was on an active operation, and 2 people I was responsible for didn't come home. And the after-action process determined that the mission parameters had been set by someone in the logistics and procurement chain who had misrepresented the threat assessment for the target area. She folded the jacket across her lap. The mission documentation was handled by an office in the Defense Logistics Agency. Maddox was very still. Carver's office, he said. I couldn't prove it then. I still can't prove it definitively. She looked at the jacket in her lap. What I could do was find a thread in his network and follow it somewhere the evidence would actually hold. So you asked for the Thornfield evaluation. I identified Thornfield as a likely active site based on the readiness data. I submitted the evaluation request through the appropriate chain, and I came here. Maddox sat with that. The 2 people, he said. From the operation. Yes. What were their names? She was quiet for a moment. Sergeant First Class Audrey Cam, and Petty Officer Second Class Marcus Dell. She said the names the way people say names that they've carried for a long time. Not emotionally, not flatly, but with the particular weight of something that has been picked up and put down so many times that the motion has become involuntary. Maddox didn't say he was sorry. People who had done what he'd done knew that sorry was the wrong word, not because it wasn't true, but because it didn't reach the thing it was aimed at. He said, "You think Carver's network is what got them killed? I think the threat assessment that put us in that target area was generated from data that was manipulated. I think the manipulation happened in Carver's procurement oversight division because the operation was funded through a supply contract that his office controlled. I think whoever manipulated the data was protecting a supply chain fraud operation from interference, and we were going to interfere." She turned the jacket over in her hands. "I can't prove all of that. I can prove the supply chain fraud, and the supply chain fraud leads to Carver. And once it leads to Carver, the rest of the investigation becomes someone else's job to finish. NCIS. And whoever else follows the thread." He nodded slowly. "You could have told me this when you arrived," he said. She looked at him. "You shoved me in front of 30 people on day one." He took that. "Fair," he said. They sat in the narrow strip of shade and the silence stretched between them, but it was a different kind of silence than any silence they'd shared before. Not guarded, not combative, just two people sitting with the weight of what they each knew and the particular tiredness that comes from a night without sleep and a situation that isn't over yet. "The investigation is going to get complicated," he said. "Yes. Carver has connections in the IG's office. You know that. Reyes knows it too. She's already moving to file through a channel that bypasses Waverly's division. And if Carver finds out what's coming before the subpoenas are executed, then we built the best case we could in the time we had, and we hand it to the people whose job it is to finish it, and we accept that the system doesn't always move at the speed we need it to." She paused. "But the physical files are documented and preserved. The digital alterations are time-stamped. The two contractors from the annex are in federal custody, and Halston is asking for a lawyer, which means he's already calculating whether cooperation is worth something to him. You think he'll flip? He didn't build this. He executed it. People who execute other people's plans tend to reassess their loyalty when the plan starts failing around them." Maddox looked at the ground. "He put falsified certifications into my program," he said. "He put unqualified personnel in positions where their failure could have gotten someone hurt. In a real operation, not a training exercise. Yes. That's not—" He stopped. "A 17% readiness decline sounds like a statistic until you think about what it means in the field. I know. People died for less. I know that too." His jaw was tight. Not the tight of anger exactly. Something more like the feeling of having been used, of having had something he'd built and believed in turned into a mechanism for something corrupt, without his knowledge, without his consent, in the machinery of his own program. That was a particular kind of violation. She understood it better than she could currently say. The formal debrief happened at 1400 in the Thornfield Installation Commander's conference room, a larger, more official space than the one Elena had been using, with the base commander, Colonel James Parrish, presiding. Parrish was a lean 60-year-old with the permanent squint of someone who had spent decades in the desert sun and hadn't fully forgiven it. He had been informed of the situation at WOS 600 and had spent the intervening hours doing what installation commanders do in crisis situations, making calls upward, absorbing information downward, and building the bridge between the two. He was not pleased, not with Halston, not with the situation, not with the fact that a supply chain fraud operation had been running inside his installation for 14 months without his awareness. He was the kind of man who understood that institutional failures don't require personal malice. Sometimes they just require a good enough facade and an administrative structure with too many moving parts for any single person to monitor all of them. He understood this intellectually. It still sat badly. The debrief ran for 3 hours. Elena presented the documentation sequence, the readiness data, the certification records, the supply manifest discrepancies, the intercept, the perimeter event, the physical evidence chain. She presented it in order, with precision, without editorializing, and she answered Parrish's questions directly when he asked them and said she didn't know when she didn't know. Maddox presented the supply manifest data and the Briggs communication trace. Reyes presented the NCIS findings, the contractor identifications, and the federal subpoena status. At the end of the 3 hours, Parrish sat back in his chair and looked at the table. 14 months, he said. Nobody responded to that. How long before we have a complete picture of the network scope? Days to weeks for the digital forensics on Halston's systems, Reyes said. Federal subpoenas for the parent company records are in processing. That's a 48 to 72-hour window for initial access. If Halston cooperates, the timeline shortens significantly. What's the probability of cooperation? He's asked for a lawyer, not immunity. That tells me he's weighing options. I'd call it moderate probability within the next 72 hours. Parrish nodded. Commander Voss. He turned to her. The evaluation you were conducting. Yes, sir. The evaluation is suspended as of this morning. The findings will be incorporated into the federal investigation record. You understand that? I do. Your report will go to NCIS rather than Naval Special Warfare Command. Understood. He looked at her for a moment. Your service record, he said. I requested a full access review this morning. I'm still waiting for the classification clearance to come through. That's normal for that classification level, she said. What isn't normal, Parrish said carefully, is for a training program evaluation officer to arrive at an installation and within 72 hours uncover a major supply chain fraud operation, hold the installation's communication system together during an active jamming event, and physically detain 2 contractor assets attempting to destroy federal evidence. He wasn't asking her to explain. He was simply naming what he'd observed and noting that it didn't fit the category he'd been given. Elena held his gaze. I followed the data, she said, and I responded to the situation in front of me, with skills that aren't in any evaluation officer's training profile. With skills that I have. Parrish was quiet for a moment. I'm not questioning your actions, he said. I'm establishing a record. I understand, sir. Whatever is in that classified file is not my current concern. My concern is that this installation was compromised on my watch and that the personnel of this installation performed well under an unexpected operational situation. He looked around the table. Gunnery Sergeant Portman, Captain Reardon, Senior Chief Maddox. The duty element. You held the line. That goes in the record, too. Portman, sitting at the far end of the table, looked at the surface in front of him and said nothing, which was his way of accepting something without making a production of it. Reardon nodded once. Maddox, across the table from Elena, was looking at his hands. He had said almost nothing for the last hour of the debrief. Not because he was disengaged, he'd been present, alert, answering when asked, but because he was processing something that didn't finish processing quickly. The kind of thing that required quiet and time and the space to sit with the specific discomfort of having had someone completely wrong. After the debrief ended and the room was clearing, he stayed in his chair. Elena gathered her notebook and her documentation. She was almost to the door when he spoke. Voss? She stopped. She didn't turn immediately, just stopped. I treated you like a problem that needed to be managed, he said, from the moment you walked in. You did. I was wrong. She turned then. I was still sitting at the table, elbows on the surface, looking at her directly without any of the defensive posturing that had characterized everything about him for the first 48 hours. Just a man saying a thing he meant. Yes, she said. You were. I'm saying I was wrong. I heard you. A pause. That's all you're going to give me? What else did you want? He thought about it. I don't know, he said. I thought... He stopped. I'm not good at this. At apologizing? At being wrong. She looked at him. Nobody is, she said. The ones who are actually good at it have usually been wrong a lot. Practice helps. He almost smiled at that. I want to understand what happened in that operation 18 months ago, he said. The one you came here because of. That's not something I can discuss in an unsecured room. I know. I'm not asking for that right now. A pause. I'm asking if you'll tell me eventually. Elena looked at him for a long moment. Buy me a better cup of coffee than the stuff they're running through the mess hall urn, she said, and we'll see. She left. Maddox sat at the table by himself. Outside the conference room, the installation was returning to the uncomfortable normalcy of an organization that has experienced a shock and has to now figure out what comes next. Marines moving between buildings with a slightly elevated tension, administrative personnel running unfamiliar queries, two NCIS agents visible at the far end of the compound setting up a mobile documentation station. Greg Halston was in a room somewhere in this building with a lawyer who had arrived at 11:30, making calculations. Rear Admiral William Carver was in an office somewhere in Northern Virginia, not yet aware of what the morning had produced, his network beginning to develop the first fractures at the points farthest from where he could see. And Elena Voss was walking across the Thornfield compound in the hard afternoon light, with a bruised arm and a worn canvas notebook, and the particular quality of a person who has pushed one very large stone to the edge of a very steep hill and is now simply waiting for the laws of physics to finish the work. She didn't look relieved. She didn't look victorious. She looked tired in the way that someone looks tired who has been carrying something heavy for a long time and hasn't yet put it all the way down, because the thing that she came here to finish was not fully finished, and the names she had said aloud for the first time in months were still in the air, somewhere, and she could feel them the way you feel weather that hasn't arrived yet but is already changing the pressure of everything around you. Sergeant First Class Audrey Cam. Petty Officer Second Class Marcus Dell. She kept walking. The desert wind came off the flats and moved the dust across the compound in long, flat sheets, and the installation settled into its afternoon rhythms around her. And somewhere beyond the northern wire, a bird she couldn't see was making a sound that carried clearly in the dry air, insistent and uninterested in anything that had happened or was happening below it. The bird she couldn't see kept calling for another 30 seconds, and then went quiet, and the desert settled back into the particular silence of a place that has no interest in human timelines. Elena stopped walking at the far edge of the compound, near the eastern fence, about 40 meters from the annex building. The storage cabinet was still in there, still padlocked, though the contents were now documented and photographed and distributed across 3 separate secure locations. The cabinet itself was evidence. Everything in the annex was evidence. In 2 days, it would all be transferred to NCIS custody, and the annex would go back to being a room full of equipment racks and fluorescent light. She stood at the fence and looked through the chain link at the flat desert beyond. The desert didn't care about Carver, didn't care about Halston or falsified certifications or $80,000 in missing consumables or the particular political architecture of a procurement oversight division that had learned to move money sideways without leaving footprints. The desert had been here before all of that and would be here after, hot and indifferent and exactly itself. She put her hand on the fence. The metal was warm from the sun. She thought about Audrey Cam, who had kept a photograph of her daughter taped to the inside of her kit lid, and who had laughed at things that weren't that funny because she said the world needed more laughter than it produced. She thought about Marcus Dell, who had been 26 years old and had wanted to open a restaurant when he got out, and had argued passionately and incorrectly about the best way to make rice. She had said their names aloud today, twice. For 14 months she had mostly said them inside her head, in the quiet of Zo 300 when she couldn't sleep, which was most nights. Saying them out loud didn't make them more real. They were already completely real. It just made the space around them feel different, less pressurized, as if naming something released some of the force that containing it required. She didn't stay at the fence long. There was still work to do. Halston made the call at 1617. His lawyer, a civilian defense attorney named Ferris, who had been doing military-adjacent federal work for 20 years and understood exactly what the evidence picture looked like, advised cooperation at 15:30 and spent 45 minutes working through the implications with his client before Halston picked up the phone and asked to speak to Special Agent Reyes. The conversation was not emotional. Halston was not the kind of man who became emotional in professional settings. It was probably the quality that had made him useful to Carver's operation in the first place. He laid out what he knew in the ordered, administrative manner of a man who had spent his career managing information, and what he knew was considerably more than Reyes had anticipated. Carver's network ran across 7 installations in the western region, not 14. 7 active sites, with Thornfield being the most recently activated. The operation had been running for 22 months. The total invoiced amount across all sites was approximately $4.3 million. The actual equipment shortfall, the money that had moved out of the supply chain and into a series of shell entities that Halston could name and partially document, was approximately $2.9 million. The captain in the IG's office, Waverly, had received payments through one of the shell entities totaling just under $400,000 in exchange for closing the 3 procurement audit flags that Maddox's contact Briggs had identified. And there was a fourth name, a logistics contractor named Stell, who had served as the operational coordinator between Carver's office and the installation-level executors, who had recruited Halston, who had organized the contractor assets that came through the eastern fence, and who was currently in a hotel in San Diego that Halston knew the name of because Stell had given it to him the previous evening as a contact point. Reyes was on the phone to her field team before Halston finished the sentence. Elena heard about Stell's arrest at 1842 from Reyes in the small conference room that had become their unofficial operational center. Hotel room in Pacific Beach, Reyes said. He was in the middle of packing when the team came through the door. Had a laptop, 2 phones, and documentation that we're still processing, but that appears to include communication records going back 18 months. Communication records. Between Stell and Carver's office. Encrypted, but our digital forensics team cracked the application key within 2 hours. The content is... Reyes paused, which was unusual for her. It's thorough. These people kept records. I think they felt safe enough that they kept records. People who feel safe make mistakes, Elena said. Yes. Reyes set down the legal pad she'd been holding. Commander, the communication records include references to the operation you ran 18 months ago, the one in your classified file. Elena went very still. What kind of references? There are 3 messages between Stell and a contact in Carver's office. We believe the contact is Carver directly, but we're still working the attribution, discussing an upcoming joint special operations mission in a specific region. The messages discuss the mission in the context of potential interference with supply chain activity in that region. Reyes met her eyes. The third message discusses the threat assessment documentation for that mission and references a specific modification that was made to the threat level categorization for the primary target area. The room was very quiet. They modified the threat assessment, Elena said. We believe so. The documentation itself is still classified and will need additional authorization to access it directly, but the communication records refer to it in enough detail to establish the connection. They knew we were going in. We believe they knew a joint operations team was going in. We believe they adjusted the threat assessment to underrepresent the hostile presence in the target area. We don't know yet whether they understood the specific consequences of that adjustment or whether they understood, Elena said. Reyes stopped. They understood, Elena said again. You don't modify a threat assessment for an active special operations mission without understanding what an underrepresented threat level means for the people going in. Her voice was level, completely level. The kind of level that costs something to maintain. We don't have evidence yet that the intent was to cause casualties, Reyes said carefully. The intent may have been purely to protect the supply chain operation from interference, to reduce the mission scope, or cause it to be redirected. The casualty outcome may have been a consequence they were willing to accept. Reyes said nothing. Elena looked at the table. She thought about the difference between intending harm and accepting it as a cost. Lawyers cared about that distinction. Courts cared about it. She understood why they cared about it. The distinction mattered for the specific formal purposes of prosecution and sentencing, and she wanted prosecution and sentencing to happen correctly. But Audrey Cam was equally dead either way. And Marcus Dell. She put her hands flat on the table. What's the status on Carver? She said. Federal arrest warrant is in processing. His office was contacted at 1800 under the pretense of a routine procurement inquiry. He's still in the building. The moment the warrant clears, which should be within the next 2 to 3 hours, the San Diego field team executes. Waverly? Simultaneous execution. We don't want either of them making contact with the other before arrest. And the 4 remaining installation-level executors? The other sites? Each site has an NCIS field contact. We're coordinating simultaneous documentation preservation across all 7 locations tonight. Arrests follow the evidence chain. Halston is the only one who's cooperating at this stage, but the others don't know that yet. Elena nodded. She stood up from the table. Is there anything else you need from me tonight? Reyes looked at her. Go get some rest, she said. You look like you've been awake for 40 hours. 36. That's not better. She didn't go to her quarters. She went back to the eastern fence. It was full dark now. The sky overhead, the specific deep navy of a desert night that has no light pollution to soften it, and the stars were extraordinary in the way they always were out here, dense and clear, and making the sky look three-dimensional rather than flat. Layers of light behind layers of light going back to a distance the mind couldn't hold. She stood at the fence with her jacket on and her hands in her pockets and her chin up. She stood there for a long time. She wasn't making peace with anything. She didn't believe in that framing. The idea that there was some internal transaction you could complete that would leave you balanced and resolved and free of the weight of what had happened. The weight didn't go away. You just got stronger, or you got broken, and the difference between those outcomes was not always under your control and was never as simple as choosing to be okay. What she had, standing at the fence, was the knowledge that the thread she had followed had held, that the evidence existed and was preserved and was in the hands of people whose job it was to use it, that the names of two people who had been failed by a system they trusted would now appear in a federal investigation that would eventually, through the slow and imperfect machinery of institutional accountability, produce consequences. Not justice, exactly. Justice was a word she had become careful with, but consequences. Real ones. Public ones. The kind that couldn't be quietly resolved or filed away. That was what she had come to Thornfield for. She had it. She heard footsteps behind her, one set, measured, the particular cadence of someone who has spent enough time in the field to move with deliberate noise when approaching someone from behind in the dark. Maddox stopped beside her. He was holding 2 cups of coffee. He handed her one. She took it. "Mess hall," she said. "Supply room in the east building. Someone keeps a decent single-serve machine behind the equipment cabinet." She drank. It was marginally better than the mess hall. They stood at the fence in silence for a while. "Reyes briefed me on the communication records," he said. "I know. I saw her going toward your building." 2.9 million, he said, "across 7 installations, 22 months. Yes. And the operation 18 months ago. Yes." He drank his coffee. "I'm sorry," he said. The 2 words sat between them, simple and insufficient in the way that the correct words usually were insufficient for the things they were pointed at, and she let them sit there rather than dismissing them or redirecting the conversation. "I know you are," she said. "Was that why—" He stopped. "When you walked into my briefing and It had nothing to do with you," she said. "I would have been here regardless. Thornfield was where the thread went. But I made it harder." "You made it louder," she said. "Harder is a different thing." He was quiet for a moment. "The thing you said in the conference room today, about not being good at being wrong." She looked at her cup. "You're not as bad at it as you think." He made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "Don't do that." "I'm not doing anything." "You're being generous." "I'm being accurate." She looked at him. "You heard the data. You adjusted. You didn't make it about yourself after the first day. Those are not small things." He was looking at the fence. "I shoved you." "Yes, and that's in the documentation, and what happens with it is a process I don't control and wasn't asked to control." She paused. "What I will tell you is that in the 48 hours after that, you helped me do what I came here to do. Both of those things are true simultaneously." That's a generous way to frame a man putting his hands on a superior officer. "I told you I'm being accurate, not generous." He was quiet. The desert wind picked up briefly and moved across the fence line, carrying the smell of dry soil and distance, and then settled back into stillness. "What happens to you now?" he said. "The evaluation is incorporated into the federal record. My report gets filed through Reyes, then I go back to San Diego and wait for the next assignment." "And the classified work is whatever it is." "That's not an answer." "It's the answer I have." He turned to look at her directly. "Would you come back here?" he said. "Not for an evaluation, as an instructor. There's a gap in the JTAC integration program curriculum that I've been trying to fill for 8 months. The kind of gap that your skill set would cover in ways that no one I currently have access to can." She looked at him. "You're offering me a job." "I'm asking if you'd consider it." She thought about it. Not long, 10 seconds, maybe, standing at the fence with a cup of mediocre coffee and the stars overhead and the weight of the last 3 days settling across her shoulders. "Ask me again in 6 months," she said, "after the investigation resolves. After I've had time to... She didn't finish the sentence. After you've had time, he said simply. Yes. 6 months. Maybe 7. I'll keep the gap open. She drank the last of her coffee. That's a lot of faith for someone you tried to move off a training field 3 days ago. I learned fast, he said. She looked at him. He was looking back. Not the look from day one, not the sizing up, the categorizing, the instant dismissal of someone who didn't fit the expected shape. This was something different. The look of a person who has had their assumptions taken apart and has rebuilt something from the pieces that was more honest than the original. Good night, Senior Chief, she said. Good night, Commander. She walked back toward the compound. The arrest warrants executed at 22:14. Rear Admiral William Carver was taken into federal custody in the parking structure beneath his office building in Northern Virginia, 7 minutes after leaving the building for the evening. He did not resist. He said nothing. His attorney, already contacted and en route, would later describe him as calm, which was what people said about people who understood that the situation was what it was and that performance at that stage changed nothing. Captain Waverly was arrested at his residence at 22:19, simultaneous with Carver, as planned. He had been drinking and was visibly unsteady when the agents came to his door, and he said several things that his attorney would later wish he hadn't said, and that the federal investigation record would include verbatim. Stell remained in federal custody from his Pacific Beach hotel room. Halston remained in custody and in cooperation. The other 6 installation-level executors were served with detention orders and documentation preservation injunctions between 2100 and 2300, and none of them were Halston. None of them had his particular calculus of risk tolerance and administrative efficiency. And so the cooperation negotiations that followed over the subsequent weeks were slower and more contentious, and produced the kind of fragmentary, lawyered testimony that prosecutors work with rather than the kind they prefer. But it was enough. It was more than enough. 6 weeks later, Elena was back in San Diego, sitting in the office of Rear Admiral Patricia Novak at Naval Special Warfare Command, in a chair across from a desk that held a formal review file with her name on the tab. Novak was 62, small and precise, with the kind of institutional authority that didn't need volume to be apparent. She had commanded and been commanded, and had developed across 35 years of service a comprehensive understanding of the distance between what organizations said they valued and what they actually did. She opened the file. The federal investigation into Carver's network is formally documented, she said. The evidence chain is intact. The classification review of the mission records from 18 months ago is complete. Elena said nothing. The review determined that the threat assessment for Operation Harrow was materially modified by a member of Carver's procurement oversight team on the direct instruction of Rear Admiral Carver. The modification reduced the hostile presence rating for the target area by 2 classification levels. That modification was provided to the Joint Operations Planning Team as verified intelligence. Elena's hands were still in her lap. The review further determined that the casualties sustained during Operation Harrow, Sergeant First Class Audrey Cam and Petty Officer Second Class Marcus Dell, were directly attributable to the threat environment presented by the target area at its actual threat classification level, rather than the modified classification provided to the planning team. The office was quiet. They were killed because of a lie, Elena said. They were killed because of a deliberate and criminal falsification of threat intelligence for financial gain, Novak said. Yes, that's what I said. Novak held her gaze. The findings of the classification review will be incorporated into the federal prosecution. The prosecution team believes it supports an additional charge of involuntary manslaughter through criminal negligence. A pause. Commander, the review also cleared the mission planning record for Operation Harrow of any finding of negligence or command failure. Elena looked at the desk. That finding applies to you, Novak said. I know what it applies to. For 14 months you carried operational responsibility for those casualties. Yes. That responsibility was not yours to carry. Elena didn't respond immediately. She looked at the window behind Novak's desk, at the slice of San Diego sky visible between the blinds. A hard, clear California blue with a commercial aircraft crossing it in the upper right corner, moving slowly enough at that altitude to look almost still. I know, she said finally. I understand that. intellectually. But Audrey Cam is still dead, and Marcus Dell, and knowing why, and knowing who is responsible, and being told officially that it wasn't my failure. She stopped. It helps. I'm not saying it doesn't help. It's just not the same as them being not dead. Novak was quiet for a moment. No, she said. It isn't. She closed the file. I'm recommending you for a commendation for the Thornfield investigation, she said. The recommendation is going forward regardless of your input on the matter, so don't waste my time arguing about it. I wasn't going to argue. You looked like you were thinking about it. I was thinking about the 7 people who transferred into Thornfield on falsified certifications, Elena said. They need to be retrained and recertified correctly. The program curriculum needs to be updated. There are gap items in the documentation that nobody is positioned to fill. Novak looked at her. Maddox submitted a formal request for a permanent training integration advisor position at Thornfield 3 weeks ago, she said. He named a specific candidate. Elena said nothing. The position has been approved, Novak said. Whether the specific candidate accepts it is a separate question. What's the assignment timeline? Flexible. Given the circumstances, there's latitude for a candidate to take additional time before reporting. How much latitude? Within reason. Elena thought about the fence line in the dark, the coffee that was marginally better than the mess hall urn, the gap in the curriculum that had existed for 8 months, the 7 Marines who needed someone to actually teach them what they should have been taught before their certifications were stamped by a man who had needed them to be unaware. She thought about Lance Corporal Denton, frozen for 47 seconds in front of a backup comms card he had never seen. I'll need 4 weeks, she said. Novak made a note. 4 weeks, she confirmed. The assignment letter will be ready by end of week. Elena stood. At the door, Novak's voice stopped her. Commander? She turned. Novak was not a woman who spoke in large gestures. What she said simply, and she said it once. You did good work, she said. All of it. The kind that doesn't come with clear instructions or guaranteed outcomes, and that most people would have found a reason to step back from. A pause. Com and Dell would have known that. Elena held the door handle. She didn't say anything, but she didn't look away either, and she didn't pretend the words hadn't landed, and after a moment she nodded once, a small, honest acknowledgement of something received, and she went out. The drive back across San Diego took 40 minutes in the early afternoon traffic, and Elena sat in it without music, without the radio, without anything but the sound of the city and the slow movement of vehicles around her and the particular quality of a mind that has been running at operational intensity for weeks and is now, in the specific anticlimax of a thing concluded, trying to figure out what the next gear down feels like. It felt strange. Not bad, just strange. The way quiet feels strange after sustained noise. The way stillness feels strange after sustained motion. The body and mind taking stock of the new condition and deciding what to do with it. She stopped at a grocery store on the way home. She bought coffee, actual good coffee, not the institutional kind, and bread and things to make a real meal rather than the combination of mess hall food and grab and go that had sustained the last 6 weeks. And she drove the rest of the way home with the grocery bag on the passenger seat and the windows down and the October air coming through the car at the specific temperature of California autumn that never fully committed to being cold, but at least stopped pretending it was summer. Her apartment was on the 3rd floor of a building 2 blocks from the water. It smelled like the absence of a person who had been away, which was a specific smell, closed air and the ghost of the last thing she'd cooked before she left, which had been eggs, apparently. She opened the windows. She put the coffee on. She sat at the kitchen table while it brewed with her notebook open, and she wrote 2 names at the top of a clean page. Audrey Cam, Marcus Dell. She sat with that for a while. Then she wrote, underneath, November 14th, investigation complete. Evidence preserved, charges filed, account rendered, not closed. She didn't write closed, because it wasn't closed in the internal sense, and she wasn't going to lie to a piece of paper about what closed felt like versus what this felt like. But rendered, accounted for, brought forward into the light where it could be seen and named and dealt with. She closed the notebook. The coffee finished brewing. She poured a cup and stood at the open window and drank it, and looked at the ocean 2 blocks away, visible between the buildings as a strip of flat gray blue, moving the way it always moved. The way it had been moving before all of this, and would keep moving after. And she stood there until the cup was empty. 4 weeks later, she drove back to Thornfield. The same desert, the same pale hardpack, the same chain-link fence and concrete buildings and sky that went on forever in every direction. The training ground was running an exercise when she arrived. She could hear the radio chatter from the gate, the specific frequency of voices managing a scenario under pressure. Portman met her at the administrative building. He looked at her car, looked at the bags in the back seat. "You actually came back," he said. "I said maybe 7 months. It's been 4 weeks. I was being conservative." He almost smiled at that. She followed him inside and he showed her the office they'd set up, small, functional, with a window that looked out at the training ground and a desk that was solid, and a chair that was less solid but workable. Someone had put a decent coffee machine on the credenza, the kind with the individual pods, not the institutional urn. She set her notebook on the desk. "Where's Maddox?" she said. "Running the exercise. He'll be done in 40 minutes. "Good." She looked at the window. On the training ground, she could see the exercise in progress. Multiple elements moving through the urban sector, radios active, someone managing a communications event with more composure than Denton had managed 6 weeks ago. "I want to see the updated curriculum documentation before I talk to him." "I'll get it." Portman left. She stood at the window and watched the exercise. It was imperfect. She could already see 2 things she would want to adjust: a sightline issue in the southern approach and a radio handoff protocol that was losing time at the transition point. She filed both away. Outside, the training ground worked through its complications with the particular mixture of discipline and improvised adaptation that characterized real military training, not the sanitized version that certification records tried to contain and define and which life in the field inevitably exceeded. She watched. She took out her notebook. She began at the top of a new page writing the outline of a curriculum module. The first one, the one that would address the gap that had existed for 8 months, the one about backup communications protocol under pressure, designed not for someone who already knew the procedure, but for someone encountering it for the first time in conditions that made thinking difficult. Designed for someone like Denton. She wrote for 30 minutes. When Maddox came through the door, still in his field gear, a radio in one hand, a look on his face that was somewhere between the expression of a man who expected this and the expression of a man who is relieved that what he expected actually happened. She didn't look up from the notebook immediately. She finished the sentence she was writing, then she looked up. "You're late," she said. "I was running an exercise." The southern approach sightline in the urban sector is creating a blind angle at the third structure. Your teams are compensating for it intuitively rather than through protocol. That needs to be in the curriculum. He stood in the doorway. "You've been here 20 minutes. 30. He looked at the notebook on her desk, at the lines of writing covering the top half of the page, at the coffee machine on the credenza that he had put there himself the previous week, in the specific hope that it would matter. He didn't say anything about any of that. He said, "The curriculum documentation is in the system. Portman has the access codes for your profile." "Good. There are 7 personnel who need to be recertified correctly. I'd like you to run that process." "I know. I'll need 2 weeks to review their individual assessments before I design the program." 2 weeks. "Maybe 3. He looked at her. "You're going to be difficult to work with," he said. "You already knew that." "I did," he said. "I hired you anyway." "Asked," she said. "You asked. Semantics." She looked at him. He was standing in the doorway of a small office in a desert installation in Southern California, with dried dust on his boots from the morning exercise and a radio that was crackling softly with the tail end of post-exercise communications. And he was looking at her with the expression of someone who has learned something at some cost and is still learning it and doesn't expect to stop. That was the version of him that was worth something. That was the version of most people she had found, the one that came after the mistake, after the reckoning, after the moment when the story they told about themselves ran out of room for the reality in front of them. "Close the door," she said, "and get me the curriculum files. We have work to do." He closed the door. He got the files. They sat across from each other in the small office, with the training ground visible through the window and the coffee machine running on the credenza, and they worked through the afternoon into the early evening, arguing about sightlines and protocol language and the correct way to format a backup communications card for someone who had never used it in their life, and neither of them was right about everything, and neither of them pretended to be. And the work was slow and complicated and necessary in the way that the most important things usually were. Outside, the desert did what it had always done. The sun moved across it, and the shadows changed, and the wind came off the flats, and the training ground waited for the next morning, and the people who would come to it, and the things they would learn or fail to learn and try again. The work continued. It always did. The most dangerous thing you can do to someone who carries real strength is to underestimate them, not because they'll prove you wrong, though they will, but because in the time you spent dismissing them, you learned nothing. And in the end, what you didn't learn is what will cost you everything.